Chapter 3, Story Part 1. Anishinaabe people, us, lived on these lands for thousands of years. Some of our brothers decided to walk as far east as they could go, and some walked west, and some crossed great stretches of narrow earth until they reached other parts of the globe. Many of us stayed here. We welcomed visitors who renamed the land Canada. Sometimes things got real between us and newcomers. Sometimes we killed each other. We were great fighters, warriors. We called ourselves and each other, and we knew these lands, so we kicked a lot of ass. The boys always puffed out their chests when Mig got to this part, and the women straightened their spines and elongated their necks, their beautiful faces like flowers opening in the heat of the fire. But we lost a lot. Mostly because we got sick with new germs. And then, when we were on our knees, with fever and pukes, they decided they liked us there, on our knees, and that's when they opened the first schools. We suffered there. We almost lost our languages. Many lost their innocence, their laughter, their lives. But we got through it, and the schools were shut down. We returned to our home places and rebuilt, relearned, regrouped. We picked up and carried on. There were a lot of years where we were lost, too much pain drowned in forgetting that came in convenient packages, bottles, pills, cubicles where we settled to move around papers. But we sang our songs and brought them to the streets and into the classrooms we built on our own lands and filled with our own words and books. And once we remembered that we were warriors, once we honored the pain and left it on the side of the road, we moved ahead. We were back. Minerva drew a big, wet sniff, wiped her nose across her sleeve, and then set about chewing the fabric once more. Then the wars for the water came. America reached up and started sipping on our lakes with a great metal straw. And where are the freshest lakes and the cleanest rivers? On our lands, of course. Anishinaabe were always the canary in the mines for the rest of them. Too bad the country was busy worrying about how we didn't pay extra tax on Levi's jeans and Kit Kat bars to listen to what we were shouting. The Great Lakes were polluted to muck. It took some doing, but right around the time California was swallowed back into the ocean, they were fenced off, too poisonous for use. I'd seen the Great Lakes, Ontario when we were in the city, and Huron when we lived on the new road allowance. The waters were gray and thick like porridge, and in the distance anchored ships swung silent and shuddered, back and forth on the roll of the methodical waves. The water wars raged on, moving north, seeking our rivers and bays, and eventually, once our homelands were decimated and the water leached and the people scattered, they moved on to the towns. Only then were the armies formed, soldiers drafted, and bullets fired. Ironically, at the same time, rivers were being sucked south and then east to the highest bidder. The north was melting. The melt put most of the Northlands under water, and the people moved south or onto some of the thousands of tiny islands that popped up out of the melt's wake across the top of our lands. Those northern people, they were tough, though, some of the toughest we've ever had, so they were okay, are still okay, the tales tell. Some better than okay, and that's why we move north towards them now. Mig stood, pacing his story pace, waving his arms like in slow-motion conductor to place emphasis and tone over us all. We needed to remember Story. It was his job to set the memory in perpetuity. He spoke to us every week. Sometimes Story was focused on one area, like the first residential schools, where they were, what happened there, when they closed. Other times he told 100 years in one long narrative, blunt and without detail. Sometimes we gathered for an hour so he could explain treaties, and other times it was 10 minutes to list the earthquakes in sequence that they occurred, peeling the edges off the continents backed like diseased gums. But every week we spoke, because it was imperative that we know. He said it was the only way to make the kinds of changes that were necessary to really survive. A general has to see the whole field to make a good strategy, he explained, and when you're down there fighting, you can't see much past the threat directly in front of you. The water wars lasted 10 years before the new set of treaties and agreements were shook on between world leaders in echoing assembly halls. The Anishinaabe were scattered, lonely and scared. On our knees again, only this time there was no home to regroup at. Meanwhile, the rest of the continent sank into the new era. The world's edges had been clipped by the rising waters, tectonic shifts, and constant rains. Half the population was lost in the disaster and from the disease that spread from too many corpses and not enough graves. The ones that were left were no better off, really. They worked longer hours, they stopped reproducing without the doctors, and worst of all, they stopped dreaming. Families, loved ones, were torn apart in this new world. He stopped suddenly, and the fire bouncing over the plains in his face. Something so sad it hurt to look in his eyes. And then the rain started again, and he couldn't continue. Couldn't walk us into the darker parts of story. Not now. Enough for tonight, then. And we packed up what lay about while the fire still burned. Carrying the tarp that we used as a dining room table over to the tents, I heard her call, "French?" I sighed and dropped my shoulders, still smiling. "Yeah, Ree? Can't sleep." This was fast becoming the routine. I heard story, she did not. So she would ask me to tell her stories, innocently enough, but desperate for some understanding. The understanding that was withheld from her youth so that she could form into a real human, before she understood that some saw her as little more than a crop. "Be there in a minute, 'kay?" I pegged the tarp between Riri and Minerva's tents so they'd have a little covered walkway should they have to use the washroom during the rainy night. I carried over the clean latrine bucket and a smaller bucket half filled with water for washing up, and then I took off my boots at the door and joined Riri in her tent. Until last month, she'd shared a tent with Minerva, but she was getting older and she had demanded some space, which was granted. We encouraged independence in our own family. We never knew when someone would be on their own, even at 7. The tent was small, and the firelight from outside made everything the same red as the vinyl walls. She had made a nest of her blankets in the middle on top of her blue ground tarp, away from the walls that could hold condensation and spread dampness in a good enough downpour. I lay down beside her on top of the blankets. Her pillow was like all of ours, a case stuffed with folded clothes. There was no room for extras in the camp. Everything did double duty. Before I even laid my head down, she was after story. "Tell me what happened, French, please." "Ree, you know I can't tell you." "But why? Why can't I know?" She lifted herself up on an elbow, pleading. "It's no fair. I get sent away all the time." I rolled over onto my back, reaching up to tap the raggedy dream catcher I'd bent out of branches and filled with vines for her so that it swung on a string. "It's for your own good." She squinted at me in the red gloom. "That's a load of bull. I deserve to know my own history." It was getting more difficult to reason with her, especially when she made sense. Riri had just been a baby when I joined the camp, newly walking and bucket trained. For some reason, she quickly grew attached to me. Meg thought I must have reminded her of someone from her original family. Whatever the reason, I often had a chubby shadow throughout my day. Now that she was a real kid with her own duties and her own mind, it was becoming increasingly hard to relegate her to the shadows and to ignore her request for information, for background to her difficult life. "Ree, Slopper was allowed to hear story when he was younger," I began. "What? That's no fair." She was up on her knees in a flash. "How come he got to hear?" Relax. I pushed her shoulder, trying to get her to lie down. "Listen to me, please." I stopped talking until she grudgingly laid back on her side, facing me. "Slopper was allowed to hear story a couple of years ago when he was your age. He didn't even hear it all, and it didn't turn out so well." But I'm not Slopper, French." She had sprung back up. "I can handle it. I'm mature for my age." I laughed at this. "I know that's true, Ree. You're practically a grown-ass lady." She pursed her lips, checking my face for mockery. When she found none, she gave me a stiff thank you. "But it's about timing. Mig will let you know the whole story when it's time. Slopper was pretty messed up for months afterwards. He stopped playing, didn't want to learn anything, and even stopped sleeping so good." She was finally quiet. I watched the dream catcher spin to a stop. I remembered following Mitch around, bugging him for any details he might know as we tromped after my parents to the bay. I thought about the parts Meg had left out tonight, the parts that kept us running. Even still, it was unfair to keep everything from Ree. It had driven me to distraction to not know, made it harder to keep moving day after day without understanding what was on our heels. Maybe, yeah, I think I can share some things, though. Her eyes grew big, but she held back her words. Years ago, other people, not us, they kind of got sick. Really, the whole world itself got sick. I tiptoed around the harsher images that came to mind. Like, it never used to rain all the time, and there were way more people. After the rain started and the land shifted so that some cities fell right into the oceans, people had to move around. Diseases spread like crazy. With all this sickness and movement and death, people got sad. One of the ways that sadness came out is when they slept. They stopped being able to dream. At first, they just talked about it all casual, like, "Oh, funniest thing, I haven't dreamed in months. Isn't that odd? I haven't dreamed either." Here I pitched my voice high and wiggled my shoulders to imitate a mincing kind of movement, like how I imagined white ladies did as they pushed their metal carts down the long straight aisles to gather food from boxes lined up on shelves, all of it already dead. Riri smiled at this impression. They visited their head doctors, psychiatrists, and they took pills to help them to sleep when they stopped having the will to lie down at night. Soon they turned on each other, and the world changed again. A low whistle with a fluttering end sounded outside. The alarm. I jumped up. "Where are you going?" Riri sounded frantic. She just started to hear story, and now I was leaving. "Gotta go. Something is coming." I dashed out of the tent, stepping into my boots with the laces still undone. The rest of the group, with the exception of Slopper, was around the low fire. Mega acknowledged me with a look and then sought Cheeboy with his eyes. He motioned with his head to the east of our site, keeping a crouch and hurrying to the trees. We were out in the open. It was too late to run or hide. We'd have to fight. Cheeboy pulled his long blade out from its sheath, where it had hung at his belt, and backed into the trees until the shadows covered him completely. I needed to help. I grabbed a long stick from the fire, its end glowing with orange heat scales, and waited. My hand shook so that the stick clattered a bit against the rock perimeter of the fire. Wob had crept over to crouch in front of Minerva. She nodded at me, and I scanned the forest behind them. Sweat dripped down the bridge of my nose. I blinked hard as if that would relieve its slow, maddening itch, and then I heard it. Footsteps in the bush, not heavy steps, light and cautious, just like a recruiter on the prowl. I raised the stick behind me like a bat, pulling it up over like a sword. I could hear the sizzle of the lit tip by my ear. Closer. I swallowed hard and almost coughed, catching it at the last minute so that my eyes teared over. I heard Meg owl call to Cheeboy, who answered with deep silence. Closer. The steps were slow but steady. I picked up the swoosh of the drag like a bag. Or maybe a body. Maybe we weren't the first camp to be discovered. I could swear I saw branches move in the trees just past the second row beyond our clearing. "Come on, Goof, come and get it," I whispered, tossing my weight between the balls of my feet, trying to be brave. Closer. Now I saw Mig, sidestepping between the first and second rows, his feet silent in their patched-up shoes. Why was he out in the open like that? Maybe he was playing decoy? Should I start rounding up the others to run? My breathing got louder, and the footsteps stopped. Shit, could they hear my fear? Did I give us away? What the hell? A high-pitched yell, and then 2 seconds later, Cheeboy emerged, dangling a girl by her forearm from his height. "Let go of me!" She was spinning and kicking, and I'm pretty sure she was spitting. Cheeboy pulled her out of the shadows and dropped her in front of the fire, a foot from where I stood with a dry stick raised behind my head. Meg emerged next with a large green duffel bag. "Jesus, holy God, you scared me." She was angry. Her eyes swung around the circle, taking in the fire, the tents, and the people, and then she found me. "And what the hell are you doing? Posed for a goddamn Hall of Fame statue?" She rubbed her arm where Cheeboy had held her. Meg carefully put her bag by her feet and took a few steps back. I lowered my stick and speared the ground over and over. "Some welcome," she glared at us. When I lost the adrenaline to notice the way her cheeks held shadows, but her eyes were clear, one thought jumped into my head. Please don't let her be my cousin. Please.